Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about a really common misconception out there, and that's this idea that you can do dumbbell work to fix left to right or unilateral muscle imbalances caused with barbells or with body weight exercises. So let me put on my plus 5 out of weaponsmithing, work on skill at my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. And I'm not saying this doesn't have its place as far as corrective exercises go, because they can. But if you don't understand what's causing the imbalances to begin with, and you go to dumbbells to fix it, you can actually make the problem even worse. You can actually make it worse because people have this really bizarre idea that the weight isn't loaded evenly on a barbell. I'm sorry guys, but unless you're using extremely cheap plates to where you literally have 10 pounds more on one side than the other, your left to right balance is pretty good. The majority of the weight on the barbell is actually out on the ends. All right, people need to understand that. It's nowhere near the center line. So let's say you're doing a close grip bench press, right? You do realize that if, let's say you're doing it with 225, the middle of the bar doesn't weigh that much. The bar only weighs 45 pounds because the collar is way out on the ends. And as long as you're gripping it pretty much in the same spot, you're loaded just as evenly as a barbell. And it's the same thing with a squat. It's the same thing with anything else. The reason we get imbalances is usually because of body position. It's because of body position, or it's because of mobility issues that exist within some of the joints involved. And here's what I'm talking about. Let's say that you have developed an imbalance because you favor one side on the bench press, because this is the classic example. When you see guys bench press, right, and it gets really difficult and they're a less experienced lifter, what happens? They come down. When it starts getting hard, what do? They shift and they press that side up, right? You guys watch what happens. If you're weak on the left side, this side over here, you start pressing, they shift this way. Why? Because they're getting their body under there and they're allowing the barbell to tip so that the right side can take a little more weight and they can push it up. What does that do? Well, it creates a right pec and a right tricep and a right front delt that if they were already slightly stronger, because we're very rarely evenly balanced, they just got more workload on the last rep. The rep that impacts muscle growth probably close to the most. I mean, because as we start getting into sets, we know that most of your muscle growth happens within the last 4 to 5 reps close to muscle failure. So essentially you have 1 rep, sometimes 2, near the end where the strong side actually did more work. Well, that's going to make a muscle imbalance get worse, because we all have them. We naturally have muscle balances. We favor one side. Well, what happens when you go to dumbbells? Here's the thing. With a barbell, at least it's easier to maintain the same position. With a dumbbell, because they can flow differently, what happens when you're doing dumbbells? A lot of guys flare the elbows out, which is stupid. What happens if you flare one side more than the other? Haven't you created a different loading? Haven't you already created just as much uneven loading as you had the potential for on a barbell? And what happens when we're doing dumbbells, right? Let's say we got our pair of dumbbells. We'll represent it with screwdrivers, right? We got a pair of dumbbells. So let's say we're holding them correctly with the position like this so that we don't flare the elbows. What happens if we come down, we come up and it gets hard and we shift like this? Again, the same thing that created the further imbalance with the barbell, didn't we just do the same thing with the dumbbell? What happens if you get in a machine? People say, well, just get in a hammer strength machine. Well, what happens if you get in a hammer strength machine? You see guys do this all the time. It starts getting hard. They shift. They shift over to the side. By moving your torso under the weight to change your leverages around and help lift the weight on the weaker side, because that's what happens. You're using your actual torso lean to help push that elbow up on the weak side, which then puts a little more load on the stronger side when that happens because it goes further out. You've created a muscle imbalance. The exact same thing that creates it on a barbell will create it on a dumbbell. It will create it on a machine. So if your piss poor form has created a muscle imbalance, how is a dumbbell going to fix it? If you do the same shitty form breakdown on the last rep when it gets hard with the dumbbell, isn't your muscle imbalance going to continue to get worse? Even though you got rid of the barbell, it's not the barbell's fault. It's people's piss poor form. Same thing could be said for some of this one-legged work. Let's talk about one-legged work. Let's say people have developed a left to right imbalance on the squat. That's extremely common, by the way. Which actually, if you guys noticed, actually we'll cover it in DEXA scans later. I've improved some of my left to right imbalances while doing nothing but barbell work. And a lot of it has to do with just making sure your toes and everything are even. Doing mobility work, you need to make sure that your hip mobility is slightly better than what you do on a squat. In other words, if you generally stop 1 inch below parallel on the barbell squat, you need to probably practice going 2 to 3 inches below with just some basic mobility work, right? Some third world squats, things like that. Because what happens? Usually what happens is that oftentimes a tight hip, let's say your left hip is tighter than your right, and your right's your dominant side, is your strong side. What happens when you go down into a squat? You come down into a squat, and when you come back up, sometimes you let that right side go further down. Sometimes you'll turn the right toe further out and allow yourself to put more load onto that right side. Well, that might not matter much when you're squatting 100 pounds. What happens when you start squatting 315 for reps? All right, the right side is going to become more dominant. And a lot of it has to do with mobility. So a lot of people are like, well, I'll just go to these one-legged squats, right? I'll do a one-legged squat with dumbbells, right? And you'll see Jeff Cavalier teaching that. Well, what happens when you go to those and you're doing your 3 sets of 10? What happens if you try to imitate the exact same range of motion, but what happens with your 3 sets of 10 if, because you just have better mobility and strength in the right side, you go deeper? Or particularly, what if on the 8th, 9th, 10th rep on the left side, because you're trying to do the exact same reps, you've said, okay, I'm going to do 3 sets of 10 with this weight as a corrective exercise. What happens when on the left side it starts to get difficult? You start cutting depth. What you need to do with this unilateral work is make sure that you probably go a hair deeper, that you work harder on the weaker side. In other words, you need to make sure that you get that extra depth, because what do we know about squat depth and where it affects your quads? That the deeper you go, the more the lower quad gets worked. In other words, partial squats or squats that stop short of parallel or whatever, it's more upper quad gets worked. We know the lower part of the quad actually doesn't get quite as fully engaged until you put it into the deeper stretch position at the bottom. You need to go below parallel for that to happen, to get the most work out of that. That's why a lot of powerlifters who squat with knee wraps, people say, oh, those powerlifters don't have quads. Well, a lot of equipped powerlifters don't, because they have the knee wraps to propel them out of the bottom, where normally the lower quad would play a big role. But deep raw squatters have to have massive quads, and that includes lower quads, and they all do. If you're cutting short on those reps, and let's say you already have a quad imbalance, your right quad is stronger than the left, what happens if the last couple reps on your corrective exercise, because you're too weak and it's getting harder, you don't hit full depth on the left side, and maybe you got that mobility issue? The same thing happens. You continue to build the strong side further because it gets more work. So is one-legged movements, or with dumbbells, is that a corrective exercise? If you are doing the exact same shitty technique errors, the same compensatory strength errors that you're making with the barbell, if you do it with your dumbbell or your one-legged work or your one-armed work, if you do the exact same thing, is it going to make the imbalance better, or is it going to make it worse? It's going to make it worse. So when we look at it from this perspective, the idea that dumbbells are the automatic fix isn't true, because they don't load the sides more evenly. Guys, they're the vast, overwhelming majority of the weight on a barbell is out on the ends, outside of your hands, way outside of your torso on a squat, a deadlift, a bench press, a standing press. The imbalances are caused because of torso position. They're caused because of joint angles, because you have a tighter or a weak joint that you don't allow to move as much, because it either has a mobility issue or a strength issue. We use compensatory strength to sometimes get more range of motion and do more work on the weaker side. And all of that happens with our torso position, our hip position, our shoulder position. It's a form issue. It's not an issue with the weights. So if you go into this trying to correct what you perceive as muscle imbalances with the wrong idea about it, if you don't understand what's causing it, your solution is going to make it worse. It's not going to improve it. It's because the barbell doesn't inherently create imbalances. Bad form creates imbalances, and that same bad form and that same bad mobility will carry over to dumbbell work, and your imbalance is going to continue to get worse. It's mostly technique, guys. The only exception might be hamstrings. There's different stuff with the hamstrings that can matter, and that's a different animal. And most of you guys aren't out there trying to correct hamstring imbalances. Everything else, it's almost always a technique issue. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.